Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Career in Ruins special podcast. Now, Derek, if I asked you about New Zealand, what would spring to mind to you?
Well, to be honest, three things. Three very different things. Number one, Lord of the Rings. Number two, Flight of the Conchords. Number three, Shortland Street.
Shortland Street. See, it's this level of ignorance, Derek, that has made us do this special podcast for everyone out there today. And that's because, I don't know if you know this, but it's coming up to be the New Zealand Archaeology Week.
I know, that's really exciting. And I know for a fact we have at least 6 New Zealand listeners. So it's really important to be inclusive and bring them into the podcast.
I know we've got 5 times more Australian listeners than we do New Zealand listeners, but that's not the point. We're shining a light on something that's more than just Lord of the Rings and Flight in the Conchords. So
and Shortland Street.
Oh, no, Shortland Street. So I guess we better do a roll call because we've got some special guests as well, haven't we?
We do.
So yeah, I don't know. Shall I do the checklist?
Yeah, go for it.
So Derek Pittman,
Present.
Andy Brown,
Present.
and Josie Hagan.
Present.
Excellent. Hi, you guys.
Lauren Shaw.
Present. Right. Guys, thank you for joining us for the chat. I wonder if briefly you could just give us an overview of where you're based and what your roles are within New Zealand archaeology. Andy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I'm based up in the north of New Zealand in a place called Whangarei. And I worked for a time, which is where I met you guys over in the UK at Bournemouth University. And we came back here and started a commercial company based in Whangarei, but also doing a lot of work in the central North Island. So places like the Bay of Plenty, Gisborne district and other areas. And so that's what I do most of the time.
Amazing. And Josie, what about yourself?
I'm in the Bay of Plenty in a town called Whakatane, and I work for mine and Andy's boss, Linda, in situ heritage, and just a field archaeologist, really. We do consulting on different things and help people manage the archaeology that they've somehow met with.
Do you specialise in any area particular?
Specialism probably LiDAR remote sensing.
Awesome.
I had the best teachers.
Thank you for joining us, guys. This is an exciting little bonus episode that we weren't expecting, but it's well, I think we're going to put you guys in charge largely today. We're just facilitating, but we're looking forward to hearing a bit more about the amazing archaeology of New Zealand. So I don't know who wants to kick us off by just giving us... where's best to start, Derek? Do we want to know more about archaeology in New Zealand, or do we want to know more about New Zealand Archaeology Week?
Well, I think we need to start off with archaeology in New Zealand because I know that to many of our Anglophone listeners in the northwestern hemisphere, they probably don't know a great deal about New Zealand archaeology, and I think it would be good to get a sense of what it is. What is New Zealand archaeology generally? So, Andy, would you like to talk us through it?
Sure. Well, some of you will know that New Zealand is Scotland but further. And if you're aware of the posters, we're a little country stuck down in the South Pacific, and just really floundering, guys.
You're doing a great job.
Can I start this again? Sorry, I feel like we've got to admit our mistakes when we're in them, and Derek, it's the ladder.
But, now, we might have to leave this bit in. That is one of my favourite moments in our collective lives, the ladder story, where we were both co-teaching a lecture, and you always sort of fall into analogies in lectures, and somehow, I don't know how you got there, you started to tell a story about how, was it material culture is an extension of the body, like when you carry a ladder around?
Yeah.
And I think I said something like driving a car.
Yeah. And the whole room went from like 30 kids not understanding what was going on to 30 kids completely understanding what was going on.
that common experience of running around with a ladder that everyone can relate to. But yeah, no, by all means, AB, start from scratch.
Okay, let me start that again. I can do better. So yeah, New Zealand's obviously in the South Pacific, and it's one of the last places to be settled by human beings in the world. It was kind of at the end of quite a large-scale colonization that started in the Western Pacific and moved across into Samoa, up to Hawaii, across to Rapa Nui, and then eventually down to New Zealand. And so the first colonists were Polynesian people, bringing with them a very Polynesian set of artifacts and ideas, and also, of course, crops, which is really important. And so those people had quite a big challenge when they got to New Zealand, in as much as they'd left a very tropical environment and they had to establish themselves in a very non-tropical environment. New Zealand's, broadly speaking, a temperate climate. And so that really is probably the main challenge when people first got here. And so we have, of the range of species available to people in the Pacific, probably the main ones that really took in New Zealand are the kumara, yam, taro, some other things. But kumara becomes quite important over time, and a range of things that develop to sort of, I guess, account for the poorer climate in New Zealand and things like that. And a lot of those things, particularly pits, storage pits, are a lot of what we see in the archaeological record today, particularly in the North Island. So when people first got here, they tended to focus on things that were relatively easy to get, I suppose, in the landscape. We've got some large flightless birds, we've got seals. People went after them, but over time, and actually relatively quickly, people transitioned to a fairly full horticultural type subsistence base. And that's really what we think of today when people think about Māori society, I suppose. That's really what we're thinking of, and that doesn't take too long to develop in New Zealand, a couple of hundred years. And that's, I suppose, an awful lot of the archaeology we see in the country is based around that sort of period, that later period of settlement in New Zealand. In 1769, James Cook arrives, and that really starts the European period. There was earlier contact with Abel Tasman in the 1600s, but that was relatively fleeting. So from 1769, you start to get much more European contact, and Europeans coming down and trading, whalers, sealers, all sorts of things like that. And then sort of, I guess, by the mid to late 1800s, much more prolonged settlement and people coming out there and really colonising, as the case may be. And so from an archaeological point of view, that's a period of real interest as well, that melding of two quite different cultural backgrounds or cultural areas and peoples mixing in New Zealand, be it missionary sites or just sort of sites of commerce. And so we've got a number of sites from that from that historical period in the country relating to, as I say, mercantile activity, industry, particularly gold mining, I think. And I think it's worthwhile noting as well that while we think about perhaps the European colonisation and Māori as well, that sort of gold mining activity, we see a lot of Chinese coming into New Zealand. And that's a really important part of the kind of cultural makeup of New Zealand as well. And so progressing sort of through pastoralism, all sorts of things like that up until the present day. So that's a very, very general overview of I guess what we'd see in the archaeological record and the basis for it. Very general.
That's amazing. Thank you, Andy, for that overview, and that history is really important, I think, for people to understand the transitions. People are arriving to the islands and influencing the land and the landscape. Josie, with regards, Andy touched on some of the things we might expect to see in the archaeological record. Now, all four of us here have worked in Wales in the Preseli's, looking at the stones of the Stonehenge projects, and so we've all got a pretty good handle from that or from other projects of sort of European archaeology, even in Greece, where it's relatively accessible. When we're looking at things like the planning process, generally there's a pretty simple process to follow in terms of do geophysics, do some trial trenching, perhaps do some watching briefs, etc. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I get the feeling in terms of the terrain and the sort of environmental covers and the variation that Andy touched in his sort of coverage there, that accessing and understanding those different levels and layers of archaeology and history that Andy's touched on there must be quite challenging from an archaeological point of view. I wonder, Josie, if you just talk us through about yeah, what the challenges are, what's the variety of the archaeological record and the considerations when things are going on in New Zealand?
Yeah, it is varied. It's also quite regional. So a lot of the stuff we do in the Bay of Plenty and Gisborne is more of the Māori archaeology, the pa, the pits, the terraces, all associated with like Māori horticulture and subsistence. And then down south, there's a lot more of the gold mining stuff, and yeah, all through New Zealand, really, there's the historic buildings and things like that. And yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, but archaeology is technically only protected if it's past 1900. So in the UK, we have like the rolling system. So things that were probably around in my grandparents' time are now possibly protected, but we don't have that in New Zealand. So it's just the 1900 stuff and onwards, unless something is listed, I believe. Yeah, I still haven't done too much with historic buildings or anything like that. And it would be really interesting to see all of that stuff, especially because the historic buildings are much more recent usually compared to English ones.
Just to build on that then, JC, obviously you say a lot of the stuff you work on is the older stuff. What does a week in archaeology look like in New Zealand? What is the job like?
That's good. So sometimes it's just office stuff, writing out reports and that kind of stuff. We have the ArcSite, which is run by the New Zealand Archaeological Association, and that's like a GIS website of all the recorded archaeological sites in the whole of New Zealand. And when you do a piece of archaeological work, you'll update the record that goes with that site. So that's part of the job. For example, this week, well, today, I can tell you what Andy and I did today because we're working together this morning. We had a subdivision. Oh, no, not even a subdivision. Someone was wanting to build a tiny home near a past site. So we had to scrape back the terrace that they wanted to build on and see what was underneath, and loads of pits popped out. So that was quite cool. And then this afternoon, there's a track on some headlands near us called Ngā Tapawai Toi, and they want to do DOC, who manage the headlands there, want to do track, like the visitor track upgrades. So we were just going to map all the archaeological sites and kind of let them know where, if they want to extend the track or refurbish it, where they might be at risk of hitting archaeology. And there's just stuff all over there, midden and pits and things like that. So yeah, we're just walking. It was amazing, really. We were just walking along these amazing cliffs with beautiful views, taking in the archaeology. Yeah. It's a dream job, really. It's really cool.
And I don't understand why you left England, to be honest, and went to New Zealand. I just don't get it. Just don't get it.
No, so yeah, it was a great day, really good day. And tomorrow, Andy's going off to Gisborne, which is a town far away from us. Then I'm just carrying on the track recording. But we also work in forestry quite a lot. So there's a lot of commercial pine over here. So when there's archaeological sites in there, and if they got planted or not planted, we kind of give them advice on removing trees and managing the sites that they have within their forests.
Oh, I mean, there's someone that dabbles in a bit of forestry. That sounds fantastic.
What I really like about that is to be honest, it just sounds like a day in the life of archaeology anywhere in the world, which is really, really cool. But there is the slight elephant in the room of you are working in a place that has, without downplaying it, some colonial baggage, we could say, in terms of how archaeology is done. And we know that archaeology as a discipline has its own kind of track record of not being the best in terms of how it's applied, particularly outside of Northwest Europe. And we also know, though, from previous podcasts, chatting to people like Christina Douglas, that archaeology has the power to repair and to build and to empower Indigenous communities in a way that I think the history of archaeology hasn't been particularly good at. So how does archaeology, modern archaeology, contribute to kind of the process of repair in New Zealand, in terms of how you work with the Maori communities and how you investigate sites that are ultimately their heritage?
It's a really good question. I think, look, we're trying. We haven't nailed it, I don't think necessarily, but we have, as part of the legislation, for instance, we have consultation with local hapu and iwi groups to ensure that they are aware of, for instance, if work's taking place in areas that they have interest in, that they've got an understanding of that work and have an ability to comment on it and comment on its impact, which is a good start. But I think a lot of archaeologists, and this might not have been true, 10 to 20 years ago, but certainly now, I think a lot of archaeologists are really doing a good job of trying to get a bit beyond the legislation and actually have people involved in the process from start to finish. We do a lot of excavations. I mean, even today we were out on the track, and before we did that work, there was a karakia. We had two local elders, kaumatua as we'd call them, who came and blessed the work, and took us 20 minutes, but it gave us cultural support, and it kind of covered us, I suppose, in the event that something went wrong, and so there's that sort of involvement as well. So it's involvement in terms of being able to bless the work and give the work, I think, a level of support that it needs. But I think increasingly the more interesting stuff is around actually engaging Māori in terms of not just archaeology work, but in terms of cultural work. And Josie's been doing a lot of this with her masters, which I'm sure she can talk about better than I can. But it's work that's happening across the country where actually the focus is less on just involving Māori and what we're doing from a day-to-day basis, but actually thinking about it from the perspective of, well, how can we involve Māori further up the pipeline in terms of development of research, development of questions and that sort of thing. And as I say, we're not perfect, but I think in that space there's been a lot of growth, and a lot of archaeologists are moving towards that and doing some really proactive things. So in the little space that we work in, we are talking quite a lot to various hapu and iwi about what their interests are beyond just the commercial realities of what we're doing from the day to day, but what where we could potentially push into with extra, if we had a bit of extra money, what we could do with that. Mm-hmm. And so I think Māori are themselves quite engaged in it. They are incredibly savvy, I think, in terms of understanding both the potentials and the limitations of archaeology, and also I think archaeologists are becoming more aware of the potential of integrating Māori knowledge into the kind of Western science narrative. So I think it's a give and take here, and it's a bit of a test tube, I suppose, of how that can work. As I say, we're not there yet, but there's a lot of good stuff happening around the country, I think, from a range of different parties. And as I say, Josie's been doing some things with respect to cultural mapping that she can comment on probably far better than I can.
I was quite keen to pick up on that cultural mapping, because you gave a lecture to Bournemouth a little while ago, and you mentioned some of the issues about how Maori communities were losing a sense of location within stories, and you mentioned the importance of some of Josie's research. So Josie, could you talk us through some of what you've been doing with story maps and how that can resituate stories in the landscape?
So my master's project was it was a collaboration between me as the archaeologist and then Whareongaonga Trust, which is a block of land that's owned by Māori shareholders. So with regards to the cultural mapping, that's something that they'd been doing for years and years and years and years. They had iwi researchers who had walked the landscape, knew it absolutely inside out, and knew where all the sites are, and had, the stories connected with them because they'd spoken to kaumata or the elders, and they had a really good grasp on it all. But what they actually wanted was, because I think there's like 3,000 shareholders. A lot of them live in Australia now, and they're away from the land, and perhaps don't have access to it. They wanted something that was going to be digital or transmissible for those people that don't live nearby, who can't access the land because it's steep and it's hills and takes a bit of effort getting around. So where my skill set came in as an archaeologist was, interviewing all these people that had all the knowledge. And they very kindly shared that all with me. And we made an ArcGIS story map, which kind of had together the narrative of the land, starting from like first Maori arrival and incorporating a lot of the stuff that Andy said about like the Aotearoa archaeological narrative, but mixed in with the cultural stories that they had that were really unique to Whareongaonga. It was a real privilege to do the work, and I learnt so much from those guys. I really owe them a lot. But it was just, you know, like Andy said, we're all working on it as archaeologists, what we can do, and this was one thing that I think worked. I gave a presentation to the trustees because they wanted to see the final story map, and they seemed to really, really like it. And I'm going back in August, possibly to do another presentation to an even wider audience, which will be awesome. So yeah, that was just kind of one example of how archaeology can be used to help those kind of communities or give them something that they want. I think, yeah.
That sounds like a real triumph, Josie. And I guess it's about coming up with new approaches, being disruptive to the traditional approaches in terms of engaging people using technologies such as story maps, but also making it accessible. I mean, that sounds fantastic. And is it something that would be made publicly available, or is it something that's specifically for these groups?
Yeah, specifically for them, because there is some culturally sensitive stuff in there. It's not going to be made public.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
I'm hoping. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, sorry to interrupt, I was just cut across, but I was just going to say that's fair enough. That's something they can own and they can refer to and appreciate without concern that of culturally sensitive influence on those sites and things like that. So really valuable. I'm very aware that we've been quite broad, and we talked about a number of things like site types like PARs and things like that. Or pits, but we haven't really delved into any nitty gritty as to what a par is, or why pits are important, and all these other bits. So I wondered, and it may be that neither pars nor pits are mentioned in this, but I wondered if it's time to bring back this little beauty.
Inheritance? You crave for somewhere different than Stonehenge. Stonehenge? In a world where everyone goes to regularly visited heritage sites, only one game can change your mind as to what you might be interested in. Monutrums!
I thought we put that to bed. I thought we were done with Monutrumps. Didn't we grow up?
We might have grown up, but it's always good to regress now and again. And we've got guests, so and it feels like the perfect mechanism to allow us to explore a few specific sites in New Zealand, or areas, or locations, or features that we can learn about. So I know Derek and I have done a bit of homework and identified some sites ourselves, and we've got our New Zealand experts on the line as well, who can tell us about some proper archaeology and some proper specifics. For listeners that may not have gone back to our back catalogue just yet and picked up Monutrumps, what is Monutrumps? And Monutrumps came out of the fact that we were kind of bored of every other news story being about Stonehenge, and we wanted to highlight, Stonehenge, love me, pathetic. But actually, we wanted to highlight how important so many other sites are from different time periods, from different formations, from different purposes. So we started coming up with a top trump style game, whereby one of the categories was distance from Stonehenge, and the further away it was, the better. But I think we're going to get rid of that.
We'll get some winners here, won't we?
But so we're just going to. I think what we'll look to do is just highlight a few sites, as specific sites or features or experiences within New Zealand archaeology. And Derek, why don't you go first?
Well, before I go, I just want to point out that how poorly conceived Monutrumps is. When I hear it explained back to me, it just seems like something we thought up drunk one evening.
It's got a good theme tune.
It does have a good theme tune, and I look forward to resurrecting that at least. So I'm going to start. I've got two, if that's okay.
Oh, classic Pitman.
I know, being greedy. The first one, it's not really a Trump as such, but we said the word "par" an awful lot. And of all the sites and stories I've heard from Andy and Josie about New Zealand, par is one of the thing that's interested me most. It feels very familiar, and I wonder if we ought to just get Josie maybe to explain what a par is and why it is that I find them so interesting.
I don't know why you find them interesting, Derek, but I can try. They're basically, for anyone who's seen one in England or Europe, they're like a hill fort.
There you go.
Oh, okay. There we go. That's why you find them interesting.
Carry on.
Yeah, so they would be... Par, I think, is actually just kind of means village, but usually they'd be in a defensive kind of setting. And there's lots of different types of ones. Usually they're on, a high point, good vantage point, close to the ocean or a river. Ditches and banks, which people might be familiar with, and pits and terraces. Midden often cover them, which is when people had shellfish dinner and then just threw the shells over the side. So back in the day, they would have been kind of glowing white with all these shells, and people say it's also a good...
That would have been quite stinky, wouldn't it?
Seems quite shellfish of them.
Oh.
Good one, Lawrence. I don't know. No one's ever asked me what they smell like before, but
Shellfish,
it's
I
a
imagine.
good question. Yeah, I think that answered the question.
It did definitely, and it brings me on to my next Monu Trump, which is a bit more experiential and a bit more of an experimental archaeology type site.
Oh yeah,
almost
nice.
in a way, very deeply tangentially, if you will.
Okay, I'm excited. Well, within your wheelhouse then.
Oh god, yeah. As you know, I'm a big fan of experimental archaeology and experiential archaeology, and engaging with my perception of what a place may be. For example, I was recently looking for some holiday experiences, and I found some Viking hikes you can go on in Scandinavia, which is quite fun. You dress up as a Viking and go for a walk.
That sounds good.
Which sounds
it's a proper
amazing.
like embedding yourself in the old culture, the old ways. Yeah. Okay.
And,
so is there something like that in New Zealand?
Yeah, you can stay in a hobbit hole in New Zealand, which ties in perfectly well with my perception that it is either Lord of the Rings or Shortland Street. And you can go and actually stay in a reconstructed hobbit house, which admittedly isn't particularly archaeological.
I was going to
But
say
it looks very cool. And it's a long way from Stonehenge. Can I win that?
you set the bar low. You set the bar low. But rather than bring in our experts, so you have provided a perfect segue into my Monu Trumps that I've put. And we should say that... Stop laughing, Andy. We should say this is where we're going first, because we're no experts. I mean, I don't think either of us have... I've been in an airport in New Zealand. That's about as close as New Zealand archaeology as I've come. So let's get our rubbish ones out of the way. But using... so we should say that hobbit holes aren't archaeological related at all. So anyway, but using the film theme, there you go. I've chosen... and I don't, you know me quite well. What when we think about my interests largely in archaeology, what would you say some of my favourite things are?
Trees,
yeah, correct. Landscapes,
lasers in planes.
Yeah, I'm not using them this time, but yeah, but also just and then films. I like films. So I was watching the other day Hunt for the Wilder People. Have you ever seen that film?
I haven't. Tell me
so
more.
Good.
So good. Amazing set. It's too long to give the background of the film. Go and check it out. Set in New Zealand, but set in the most beautiful backdrop. And I thought, I'm going to give that place a Google. And I did. And it's set in the, let's see if I can get this pronunciation correct, Waitakere range. How's that, Andy? All right?
It wasn't too bad, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Waitakere Ranges. Oh, the other thing that I love, right? National parks. It's a national park. Tick. Trees. Tick. Landscape. Tick. Film setting. Tick. But also, it's got loads and loads of archaeology. So this is where I do some more massacring of traditional Maori names. But it was traditionally settled by the Te Kawa Ireu Ao Maki How's that, Andy? Any idea of I masked that so
I
much you
don't
don't even
know
know
what
what I'm
you're
talking?
saying, so I'm
Okay, we'll put it in the text. We'll put it in the podcast text. But basically, there's over 50 par sites in this ranges, so that's how big this area. There are over 50 hill fort type sites, over 550 archaeological records, and what with the amazing waterlogged conditions, they also have things that traditionally perish, so such as timber, materials, and fabrics. That they've got these incredible records from excavations in the early 20th century of traditional Maori sort of very fragile, very perishable materials that have sort of set the understanding and appreciation for some more of the material culture that goes with the inhabitants of that time period. So, a very long-winded way of saying I've just chosen a film setting for my money drums.
What I like there is you've googled two things rather than one thing, so well done.
Honestly, though, Lawrence, that's wicked because I've heard of the ranges, but I didn't know there was archaeology there. So I'm learning something new.
Excellent time. I think maybe we should all fly out and go and have a look at it.
Yeah, see you there.
It's a good idea.
If people want to go to our Patreon page and donate some,
I mean that may be the first time anyone's learnt anything from our podcast, so that's a winner.
Let's bring in the experts. And Josie, what is your Monutrum?
Well, mine's a regional park, Lawrence. So the park itself is called Papamoa. Probably not quite as big as your one. There's 8 separate pa at Papamoa. But it is this huge hill fort complex. It's got incredible LiDAR. So I think I should send you a picture if you want to share that somewhere because it's awesome. And it's a really cool site because there's the extensive pa, but it's a working farm at the same time, so that's being managed as well. And I'm blustering my words, but there's one. Thank you. There's one pa in particular called Karangaumu, which has 169 terraces, 151 pits, and it's just huge. And it has a trig point on the top of it, so a lot of people use the park as an area for like recreation, exercise. There's a race that runs there every year. And I don't think people even realize sometimes that they're walking on archaeology. But it's just, you can't believe that you wouldn't see it because there's these like 2-meter deep ditches and stuff like that. I think I picked it because it's gorgeous archaeology, but it meant a lot to me as well because it was when I was doing my undergrad. I was looking at LiDAR covering the area and seeing if I could map the pa remotely. And Lawrence, you taught me all about LiDAR, so that was really cool. And then I kind of always saw it aerially and I thought, that's cool, it looks really amazing. And then when I first came out here and got my job with my boss, she took me there. And because she does a lot of the management of the park and knows the pa really well, she took me on a walk and took me through the whole landscape and just spelt it all out for me. And I think I got really hooked on New Zealand archaeology from that moment. It's stunning. I can't even do it justice because it's so beautiful. I'll send you a picture or something. But it's just a huge park complex, basically.
Amazing. So hidden in place. I'm sort of getting a feel for like is it the Wessex Hill Forts region? Would that be a comparable thing in Dorset? So huge numbers of hill forts along close by, part of a larger contemporary complex, or have I got that wrong?
It's even better because we took the Hill Fort Survey Group and they were blown away. So.
See, there's a selling point. Okay. See.
Also, just need to point out that I'm incredibly glad we went first and don't have to follow this.
Yes, this was deliberate.
So Andy,
Hobbit houses.
Yeah, I know. Whose idea was that? So Andy, how about you?
It's so hard. Remembering, I think that we played Moni Trumps on my last visit to the Career in Ruins hub.
Oh yeah.
So I feel as if I can't really pick those ones. And I think at that point I was pretty cheeky and picked about 3. And Papamoa Hills might have even been one. I'm not too sure. But it's really hard. I've been thinking about this all day when I've meant to be working, and So
I
difficult.
thought you seemed a bit distant.
The pressure of Money Trumps has got to him. This is fantastic.
Money Trumps is just horrible. I feel as if you, like Derek, you've gone with a place in the Waikato, so like the central North Island. You've gone with that with your Hobbit hole thing. Lawrence is the upper North Island. Joseph's the upper North Island. It's seeming a bit North Island centric. So I'm going to pick a site. I'm going to pick a site which was the first site that I ever excavated. Just because it's a South Island site and it's a little bit different. It's a site on the west coast of the South Island called Westport, or the town is called Westport. It's very cleverly named because it's on the west coast. And there's a site there called the Bulleridmouth site or Kawatiri. And it was the first site I ever excavated, and met my wife there and met a lot of the people that are still my friends there as well. And it's a really, really early site, dates from the earliest period of New Zealand, of human occupation in New Zealand. There's it's acidic soil, so there's not heaps of bone there, but there was clearly evidence of moa butchery. So that's the big animal, the big flightless bird I was talking about earlier. Really clear evidence of that, and beautiful geophysics there as well. Magnetometry done that showed sort of the different areas that people were living in. So there was a sort of an area to the south which looked like it was a big butchery and kind of fire pit area. Then the middle where we excavated seemed to be much more kind of small hearths and whare or houses and stoneworking. So we had stone from the North Island, however many kilometres away, quite a long way away. We had greenstone, we had or nephrite, we had other stone from the upper South Island. So it's just stone coming from hundreds of kilometres away to this one site, as well as people kind of living in the local economy. So it was both sort of a local site and a regional or national site, I suppose. So that's the one that sticks out to me as being pretty cool. But there are other sites that I just feel as if there's so many other type of sites out there that aren't kind of covered by this. I mean, the historical occupation, or colonial occupation, if you want to put it in those terms, is so rich, particularly in the lower South Island. I did a lot of work down there before I moved to the North Island, and gold mining sites and these amazing sites where you're in this kind of quite small valley by a river, and there's these amazing really small crevices in the rock that have been sort of bricked up or stoned up to create. There's a small stone wall and a small opening in the rock wall where Chinese miners were living, during the gold rush in the 1860s and 70s and sort of things like that. Just amazing places when you're there and it's freezing cold. You just imagine these guys out there trying to earn, a crust. Those sites as well really stand out for me. So I could do a tour all through New Zealand, I suppose, but those are a couple of South Island sites, just to sort of represent the South Island as much as I can.
I mean, hopefully what that's done, I think it's important to include your Hobbit holes, Derek, because it does represent a bit of future history and culture in terms of New Zealand's role in a pretty epic film series. But and I'm sure New Zealand use it for their advertising and promotion for tourism. So a valid inclusion. But hopefully, what that's done is provide a brief introduction to the breadth of archaeology and the composition of these things and the histories that go across New Zealand and the two islands. But Andy, Josie, we sort of agreed to do this podcast because it's all about the New Zealand Archaeology Week, which is coming up. And what do people listening to what should people that are listening to this podcast do to learn more about New Zealand archaeology, to find out about New Zealand Archaeology Week and get involved, whether that's remotely or in person? Josie, what do you reckon?
Yep, so if they Google NZAA Archaeology Week, there is online a schedule of all the events that are taking place per region. And I think a few of them will be on Zoom as well. So even if someone was in England or Australia, wherever, they could probably come in and have a listen, which would be awesome. I'm the Bay of Plenty Regional Coordinator, so I know there's quite a few things going on in Bay of Plenty, which will be awesome. We've got Kevin Jones. He does a lot of stuff with aerial photography. So he's going to give a talk about loads of par that he's done aerial photography of, which will be really cool. It's kind of up your guys' street as well.
Yeah, sounds great.
And I should tell you the dates it's running. It's from the 23rd of April to the 1st of May. But I think there's going to be a lot of online stuff as well. There is going to be a hashtag, so you can see what's kind of going on with that as well. But it's I think we're just working really hard to try and showcase the amazing archaeology that is here, because it is kind of overlooked, which is really sad. So yeah, there's talks, walks, Zoom events, and then the social media stuff as well.
Amazing. And Andy, with COVID the last couple of years, is it hope that this year's archaeology festival is going to be a bit more engaged, a bit more active, or is it same as normal?
I think every year that it seems to me, I mean, I've only been back in the country for a few years, I suppose, but it seems to me every year people are working harder at it and trying to, get more events. And I think importantly, one of the things about New Zealand archaeology is that it doesn't have a Stonehenge or the pyramids or the Colosseum or whatever. There's really clear monuments on the landscape that people often sort of think about in terms of world history. But it's got so many other sites that are equally, I think, impressive if you understand what they are and you can you can see them. And some of the best examples, for instance, are in our biggest city in Auckland. There's some amazing pa right in the middle of town. If only you knew what to look for. And I think the great thing with Arc Week is that people are willing to sort of provide that knowledge and teach people. So, I think it's hopefully getting better. Well, it seems to me that it's getting better every year. So, COVID be damned, hopefully. But, people are adapting as well as the world is, with Zoom meetings and other things, which is great. So, hopefully this year it's a little bit less virtual and people can get back face to face as well.
So valuable. Amazing. Guys, thank you both so much for staying up late and joining us for today's podcast. Deza, did you have anything else you wanted to follow up on, or?
No, I think that sounds good. Other than just keep an eye out for New Zealand Archaeology Week. We'll share some stuff on our social to make sure you've got links. And we've barely scratched the surface today. I know from many of our chats in the past with Andy, Josie, and many colleagues in New Zealand that there is so much. There's a rich archaeology out there, far beyond the nonsense Lawrence and I can pull out today. Just keep your eyes open. Follow the hashtag and see what's coming.
Thank you, guys. I just remembered something that this weekend just gone, I went for a hike with some friends to Karangahaki, which is this huge kind of gorge area. But thinking of your idea of the Hobbit hole, they have, where it's a gold mining, they have these little tunnels all over, like through the whole site. So there's all this like bridges and sluices and stuff for all the gold working, but they have these tunnels which you can walk through still, which would have been dug out, I'm assuming, either with like spades and shovels or dynamite or something, but it is kind of Hobbit sized, and it's just awesome. It's just another site that you guys reminded me of talking about the Hobbit holes. And I know that if you go at night, sometimes there's glowworms in the and stuff, so kind of even better than a Hobbit hole, to be honest.
Two of my favourite things: industrial archaeology and glowworms. Brilliant.
There's a paper waiting to happen.
Thank you for having us.
No, it's been so nice. Thank you for joining us. And to our listeners, keep listening out. We'll be back with another series at some point in the near future. But keep an eye out for Archaeology Week New Zealand.